to be some state that actually I think the closer you get to God, the more Christian and more faith you actually have to help. So you have to be God when you don't have you're going to want something else. If you like that, that's humans are in the Bible. Also, anybody who's passed the scripture on the topic of questions that we Job, read how God responded back to Job. Whenever God asked Job questions, Job didn't have any of those questions. Who am I? So my response always is there's certainly valid questions like biblical answers. So then, if you're talking about unanswerable question, like why does that happen to you or whatever, it's just, I think I would write that first. That's the Christian life. It's not having evidence, it's still putting your trust in God. You're never going to escape from that. That's the road we have to walk.
Even as like that's the question, I think like especially as an older sibling, it's important that we like so that they don't have problems if you're like asking the right thing. And then if they do it, something you can be there.
CJC.
For once.
Well, and that's social media is giving us such social media, it can be. Guess what?
That's kind of what things are above my head. I can't understand what the psalmist is saying. Is I don't engage in that kind of stuff. And this is why it says, surely I have made them like myself as a child that is even as a mother. My soul is even as a weak child. So the picture that the psalmist is saying here is like, I'm like a unweaned child. Every time they're around their mom, they have to listen to me. Mom's there on the sunset. Weaned child. You know how that's kind of probably like I don't always have this. God can be looking at that like any content not getting all the information from God. I think you should focus on child life because they are using so much effort into showing how good they are. And they're actually not because they're wasting time showing it. So you have to look past what people are showing and realize that there's a real person behind that and they're really struggling. So don't think that you're worse off because behind the scenes you don't have as good of a life as you can think.
Your pride is you think, oh, I'm not good when you're just looking through a little you can't see the whole picture.
not really debating about it. Well, discussion. Discussion. So I would, for me, I would just go to like older people who have experience.
Me too, let me do it.
Somebody's thinking.
Well, there's an answer right there. My
We're about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. We'll go back to our seats. Kids were great. 2 minutes. You're gonna share your list about it.
Richard.
You guys are lost.
Richard.
BBCJC stuff. If you're finished, you can head back. If you're not, you're finishing up right now. Kids did great. Kids going back to their parents. All right. I think I may be a little biased, but I think I had the best group tonight. Those kids were awesome. They gave me some good information. And I got to hear stories about them getting bit by dogs and stuff like that, but they did stay on task. We're going to go from oldest to youngest tonight. So I believe that means we start with Brother George and his group. Brother George and his group. Again, we had 2 questions presented. You can take both of them or one of the 2 questions and maybe focus on them. I'm not sure what you did. And we may do this again because this subject is important. You say, why would you bring this up? First, I think some of you understand why this is important. But secondly, I see a lot of this in some counseling I do. We can sometimes not have the answer when people ask us questions. I don't have the answer all the time, and I'm a pastor, but I don't have the answer. And sometimes, let's all be honest, jealousy is an issue, or sometimes we just think that somebody else has just got it all together, everything is hunky-dory for them, and we can sometimes be frustrated toward God. And the devil loves to plant seeds. How do we deal with those things? And the kids actually gave me some good stuff. So we'll start with Brother George's group, and then after that, we'll finish with George.
Was I on?
You're on.
It's kind of a proverbial circle question because I got home. It makes it work a little better, doesn't it? Anyway, things aren't always as they seem. Sometimes we think that they're getting the blessing and you're not, and you walk a mile in their shoes, if you will, and sometimes you find out that they're not as good as you think they are. God honors faithfulness. The more faithful you are, if you start going through trials and want to run and blame God, that's when you should draw nigh to God. Do more prayers and that kind of thing. That was brought up. Focus on the good of things and all the blessings He gives you. You know, He gives you every day, and quit looking at what you think other people are going through. They're all pretty much coming to the same answer. Getting closer to the Lord and dealing with hard things. we don't see we don't see the whole big picture, and God does, and we need to count on His timing, not yours, and let Him pull it together. It should be the time when you feel like you're not being blessed. You should be more prayerful, more attending to what's going on in society and life. Just to be honest with you, just to be an American and be lived in this country is a blessing. And then if you're born again, truly are born again, without sounding pious, what else you need? You know, we only here for a minute, you know, or less. It's I just said that. Okay. Be thankful for the things you do have, and be thankful. I don't know how to say it. The way it's stated is just when other people get a blessing, brag on that. You know, talk to them and be thankful for it. Don't be jealous. Well, how come I didn't get it? You may be getting something you don't realize you are getting. And then, yep, I covered that. So anyway, that's pretty much what it is. All kind of good. It's just a big circle. Just, you know, you may be getting blessings all the time, and you're just not conscious to them, and you need to be aware of that. Sometimes a lot of people never see how good God is to them. And they have one little flat tire and they go nuts. Well, that flat tire could have kept you from being killed. Could have your whole family being wiped out. You know, there's always a joke about being on an airplane and the plane going down. You might be the reason the plane didn't go down. You know, you could be the blessing of that plane that God didn't take it all out. Not the pilot goes out, we just hope you're another pilot.
Travis. Thank you, Brother George. Thank you, 50 and up. Some wisdom in there. Appreciate that. Yes, sir, Travis.
All right. Take a little of your extrovertedness, Brother George, about now. So our first question was, how do you help a brother or sister deal with the frustration of not getting their questions answered from God? And we talked about how to encourage them, help them focus back to God rather than on the problem itself, and just to give that to God. Go to the Bible. Several folks mentioned that, you know, and then pray with them. And we also talked a little bit about what if it's somebody who's younger who doesn't have the experience, because in the 30 to 49 group, we've got a little bit of experience, obviously, in the group of the George had, they have a little more. And so how do you help someone that's younger who just doesn't have that? And so kind of came up with the answer that, you know, help them find a more experienced Christian to talk to. If they don't have enough experience to have been through some of the ups and the downs and the hills and valleys of life, experienced Christians are there, and they want to help them out. God's timing is best. And then really the first question morphs into the second question in a lot of ways, because it's still the same basic question: is when God's not doing what we think He ought, we want Him to be doing, you know, how do we handle that? You know, we shouldn't be dictating to God who He is and what He does, but, you know, we do have expectations. That's just part of us. And so as we were talking about that, we always talk how faith is always part of our relationship with God, and it's that not knowing, it's that unexpected, it's wanting plans and having desires and thinking how life is supposed to be, and when those don't happen, what are we going to do? Well, that is what faith is. That's often where God wants us to be, because it's at that point that we're ready to listen to Him, and He can really work in our lives. And so it was also mentioned Psalms 131. And there's 3 verses in that chapter. I didn't know that. This is all Brother John. I can say what he says. It's usually good policy. But it starts out with, Lord, my heart is not haughty. And it just really showed how the psalmist's heart at this point would just realize how God had knocked down all of his internal strengths and dependencies and reliances. And that was exactly where God needed him to be.
So, as far as the first question went, the 20 through 29-year-olds came up with a lot of really good stuff. They're so smart. I'm just kidding. But one of the first things that we mentioned was that when somebody comes to you with a question about questions about God or uncertainties or something like that, if you don't have the answer, you could always refer them to someone who may have the answer, someone who is wiser than you, someone who has been there or knows something about that. Also, many times we can just wait on God's time, keep praying until an answer comes. Also, just be an encouragement to others. Tell your friends to stay faithful. Don't give up. Stick in there. And refer them to encouraging Bible verses, of course. Just because it isn't a yes now doesn't mean it isn't a yes in the future. It's important to not make them keep questioning. God can use us to help them keep trusting Him. It's important we give them Bible verses, like I said, to help them to continue to trust Him. So as far as the second question goes, how to respond when you see other people getting answers to prayers when you may not get any answers you may be wanting. So it might be just discouraging in some ways or another. Just remember that God is answering prayers. It just may not be the answer that we wanted. There may be many conversations of answered prayers that we focus on, while there probably are even more unanswered prayers. Friends don't necessarily talk about the unanswered prayers, so we shouldn't be comparing. There's probably unanswered prayers in our friend's life as well that they just may never be talking about. God's ways are not our ways, and God's answers are not our answers. So just because He isn't answering how we think we should be, He is still answering in His way, like they said before. Sometimes you think, God, where are you? And what do I know? But we need to focus on what we do know and what we do know about God. And through that, we may be able to allow God to give us encouragement that we need. Also, we have to remember that how we respond to something like an unanswered prayer can influence others about how they respond to unanswered prayers. So anything we do can affect others.
All right. So for the first question, how do you help your sister or brother? We got a few answers. We could either pray for them and keep them accountable, like become an accountability partner. And we could also be encouraging. Just encouraging them will help them out a lot, honestly. And we could either refer them to someone who has more wisdom or experience in what they are asking. And they could go to a deacon or elder or preacher. And so for the second question, how do you feel if someone has their life together and God is not answering your questions? You would probably feel jealous, and you would, when you focus on someone else and you miss out on the opportunities that God has given you. And that's all we got.
All right. Well, I had the kids, and they were fun. I changed the questions a little bit, just so it kind of was more more applicable to their lives, seeing as they maybe view life a little bit different than we do. One of the things that came up was talking about how to deal with when your friends come to church and they grab on Christmas presents they got that you might not have got. So that was one angle we took on that. And one of our boys said, it doesn't matter what they get at Christmas, because I know when I'm at home, I have a bigger gun than all of them. So that was encouraging. I won't say who the boy's name was, but it's fitting because the last name would happen to be Cannon, which is a weapon. So that's all I'll say. I won't name names, but I was very entertained by that. But one of the things they started to talk about was just their desire to help people. And I think it's neat when you think of a child's perspective. They may not sense jealousy or things like that the same way we do. And also, I think because we shouldn't worry about what they have or don't have because they're hurting. So they said we should help hurting people because we have for them. We should help hurting people because we love them. We should help our friends because they're our friends. And then they started to talk about thankfulness. Thankfulness helps you want to help people because you're not in the same, they didn't use this exact word, but it's kind of what I interpreted from it, the situation that they are in. Then they talked about how even if jealousy enters in the child's mind, thankfulness helps you fight that. It stops that from happening. And then we can always be thankful, especially as Americans, because all of us in this room, 2 or 3 of the kids said this, all of us have way more than like 90% of the world does. And that sparked me to tell some stories of my experiences in Ecuador and in the Philippines, which they seem to enjoy that. They talked about how not a lot of kids in this world have stuff. We have a lot of stuff, that's what they said stuff. Some of them said things like being thankful for a house, thankful for their nana and papa, thankful. One of the girls said, Many of my friends have a puppy. Someday I'm going to give you a puppy. So that's right. One day she'll be able to get her own puppy when she has her own house and her own money. She says, when I get my own money, I'm going to give you a puppy. And so that was a great answer. And I love the attitude they have. And the last thing they said was they really want to be helpful and loving to their family because some people lose family and they don't have family anymore. So even though their answers were a little different than some of yours, I like their attitude and perspective on it.
Good.
And so that leads to our discussion now. We go to John chapter 21 now. John chapter 21, I'm going to give you 3 statements to tie this together. And this is great. I personally enjoy listening to the wisdom that's up at the pews. And I thank you, moderators, for helping. I know it's a little bit of a last-minute thing. But I think America has become a spontaneous country now. If I ask them to go to lunch with me in 2 weeks, they say, call me in 2 weeks. If I ask them today, can we go to lunch? Well, not today because lunch is already passed. But tomorrow, if I call someone and say, you want to go to lunch today, and all of a sudden it works out for them, right? It's become a very spontaneous nation. It's very different. And so, by the way, if anybody knows where a lapel mic is, it has gotten legs and walked off. If we don't get it back on Sunday, we will assume that evolution is real, okay? Because it grew legs and walked off. But it was under the pulpit, so I wanted to preach on there, so it's any better, but we're going to stand here tonight. Now, how do we help others who feel like they don't have the answer? And how do we feel when we seem like our brethren have it all together and they get all the answers and we don't? I think it's important for us to look at Jesus' last conversation with his inner circle of disciples, and that's in John 21. Now, his last conversation before he ascends is in Acts chapter 1, but there was more people there than just that inner group. Now, we know Judas is gone, but the disciples had gone fishing, and his core was there, and Jesus makes this meal for them. And some interesting things happen in this chapter that I think are very important for us to take note of. Look at verses 7 and 8 real quickly, John chapter 21. It says in verse number 7, therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved saith unto Peter, it is the Lord. So he recognizes the Lord. All right, look at verse number 8. And the other, look at this, watch this, so it's not going to come together in a second, plural, disciples came in a little ship. So there was actually 2 separate water vessels, if you will, and they'd been fishing, you know the story, they'd been fishing all night long, and Jesus stands in the shore and says, children, plural, have ye any meat? And they said, none. So Jesus says, just go to the other side of the boat. And that's not typically a fishing strategy. You usually move to another side of the lake or the sea, or we'll go to a different place. But, of course, Jesus said it, and it worked, and they had all these fishes. All right, so notice that now. And we're going to get all the way. Look at verse number 15. 15. So Jesus says children, plural. And verse number 8 signifies that the disciples, plural, are there. And in verse number 15, you'll see that Jesus directs his attention to the individual. He says, so when they had dined, Jesus saith to who? Simon Peter. So Jesus is conversing with Peter. And it's evident, based on some verses that come after this conversation, that the other disciples were within earshot. Because another conversation sparks from that. We'll get to that in just a second, right? Look at John chapter 21, verse number 20. Then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following, which also leaned his breast at supper, on his breast at supper, and said, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? So they asked that question. Now, so the conversation shifts, they're all sitting around having supper, and I think it's important. So statement number 1, okay? We have to understand as Christians, in dealing with these 2 questions that can't be answered, that Jesus has messages for 3 main groups. The majority, the minority, and the individual. All right? I'm going to let that soak in a little bit. He speaks to the majority, the minority, and then directly to the individual. Now, the majority gets the same message all across the board. And Brother George made this statement, and it is easier said than done to say, well, if we're just born again, then why should we even complain the rest of our life, right? And that's really true. I mean, on paper, logically, we should be able to say, I'm saved. If he never does anything for me the rest of my life, then I should be happy. But the fact of the matter is, we still will struggle with those things.
Sure.
But the message for the majority has been said. He's not a respecter of persons when it comes to the gospel, when it comes to getting that the majority of the out to the masses, right? Now, where does that text come from? Well, the whole book of John, right? He's preaching to multitudes of people, masses of people. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus addresses multitudes of people by the thousands. And the Bible will tell us men, women, and children. And again, those were the 3 main groups he spoke to. There were no such thing as teenagers. They didn't really break out senior citizens. It was just men, women, and children, right? So typically, when you're 13 and older in the old time culture, you were considered an adult. 12 and younger, you were a child. And that's why Jesus was found in the temple at the age of 12, teaching the Pharisees, and that wasn't a huge shocker to them, because at 12, 13, you started to become a man. It's a different culture today. Teenagers the marketing world changed and came up with the idea of teenagers, and it is the culture, it's acceptable, we deal with that and all that. But biblically speaking, he dealt with multitudes of people. Right. He knew exactly what to say to the multitudes. He fed the multitudes evenly. Everybody that was there that day with the fish and bread got to eat that day. And they got to eat till they were full. We know they ate till they were full because there were 12 baskets full left in the story in the book of John. So everybody got that particular message for the multitude. So first of all tonight, remind our brothers and sisters that we've all heard the message that the whole world is supposed to hear, but has not heard.
Right.
That helps us put things in perspective. All right, let me take that a little further, go a little deeper than that. We've all heard the message that the multitudes of the world are supposed to hear hundreds of times, while most of the world has not heard it once.
Right.
Well, that right there ought to stir something in our hearts. To think we live in a country where we can still freely preach and hear the gospel anytime, anywhere, radio, internet, even on Facebook, whatever it is, you can still buy a Bible almost at any store, Walmart's and Dollar Generals, they all have Bibles. Everywhere. This country, we are blessed. We hear that, the message for the multitudes, okay? Now, then he goes to a smaller group. He has a message for the minority group, right? Minority group. When I say minority, I'm not talking about the minority. When you think of the word minority, all minority means is the smaller group than the majority.
That's right.
All right? So, the minority group in this case would be the disciples. He speaks messages to a minority group called, ready for this? Parents. He speaks messages to minority groups like to pastors. Right. Minority groups like disciples, missionaries. They get particular messages there. And again, watch this, church. He gives broad messages, but they're more specific. And see, Jesus is amazing. You think about the kind of started the shift in my generation, but there, in the old days, one doctor did everything, right? 50, 60 years ago, the doctor could deliver the baby and do brain surgery at the same time. Maybe at the same time. Like the same week, I said. He'd be really talented if he did it at the same time. That would be very impressive, okay? But they weren't specialists. But today we have specialists. And honestly, I'm thankful for that. I think it's great that you can tell a doctor to really focus in on one field and just become an expert in that field to really help us. And that's why health has been, there's been a whole lot of education on health and so on. Now, Jesus was able to treat all, but he also was a specialist. He was a specialist. Here's number 3, watch this. He also always had a message for the individual. Okay, this is the part we have to realize here, okay? When you make Jesus and your relationship personal, you'll never struggle with somebody else's relationship with Jesus Christ. See, the problem is so many Christians only have a multitude or majority and minority relationship with Jesus, but they never get to that one-on-one relationship. When you have that one-on-one relationship and you realize he does listen to you, he does give you individual things. And again, the reason I picked the book of John is because John is so unique, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, maybe they emphasize the masses and the multitudes, even though John has stories about that. John is a book all about the individual. And if you've heard me preaching at the time, you've heard me say that many times in the book of John, because you have from John chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 8, chapter 9, and now even into the teen chapters, and then chapter 21, you see Jesus one-on-one relationships with a Samaritan, a woman at the well, with a Pharisee, with a little lad who had some fishes and bread. Amazing how Jesus was able to connect to all of them. And when we lack in our individual relationship with him, we then struggle because we start comparing ourselves to don't miss this now, the minority, the majority, and the minority messages that were for all those groups. So church, you've got to find that one-on-one relationship with Jesus Christ. You see, salvation comes to us, but Christianity, we've got to start going to him more. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. All right? I preached this message before. I believe in a salvation works, not a work salvation. Salvation, he did it all. But after salvation, it takes some work. It's like a marriage, right? I can say things to the masses, to the bigger crowd, but it'll be different than when I say to my 4 children. It'll be very different than when I say to my wife individually. And that's the strongest relationship. By the way, if our relationship isn't right, you're all going to suffer a little bit, and so are my 4 kids. So if our relationship's strong, the Bible says I will not want to covet another man's wife. If our relationship is strong, then my kids will see that stability in that marriage. And you as a church will see that stability. So it goes both ways. It starts with the majority to the minority to the individual, but then the individual trickles out to the minority and to the majority. And that's what helps us when we speak to our brothers and sisters and encourage them. Now, we need a couple more things, 2 more things I'll be done. Number 2, notice this. See the similarities of the ups and downs of life. And we're going to give you statement number 3. Okay? See the differences of the ups and downs of life. Sure. All right, now, let me tie all that together. Look at John chapter 21 again, verse number 5. Verse number 5. Then Jesus saith unto, next word, then, plural, next word, children. All right? So Jesus is speaking to who? Them, plural. Then he addresses them. He doesn't say Peter in this passage. He doesn't say John. He says children, plural. That's a special group. That's what he called these disciples. Children, have ye any meat? It's a beautiful truth. They answered him no. All right? So he gives them some instructions. All right? Therefore, verse number 7, that disciple, individual, right, in verse number 8, and the other disciples came in a little ship. Look at verse number 10. Jesus saith unto them, bring them the fish which ye have now caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of great fishes, and 153. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of fish. Yeah. I've been fishing a few times in my life, and I was sort of, I got 3 when I came back. I mean, I was not good fishing, but I was too ADHD, whatever, that's a whole subject. Look at verse number. So he says he gets 153. Well, look at verse 13. Jesus saith unto who? What's the next word of verse 13? Jesus saith unto who? Them, come and dine. So everybody's going to eat this meal that's there. Not just Peter, not just John. Right. Now, this is why he's going to shift his focus to Peter and talk to Peter. But everybody got to eat that meal. Right. Everybody got to sit around and eat a meal cooked by Jesus. That'd be pretty neat. Jesus was chef tonight. Yeah. Jesus is a chef in this chapter. That's interesting. I wonder if he had the big hat and apron. I don't know. But anyway, Jesus was a chef that night, right? Okay, now look at verse number 13. Jesus then cometh and taketh bread and giveth them and fish likewise. So everybody in that group got what Jesus had for them. Verse 14, this is now the 3rd time that Jesus showed himself to his, plural, disciples. After that, he was risen from the dead. Now, before I explain this and tie it together, let me give you 2 quick statements. If you go to the average bookstore, you don't see much of those anymore. If you go to Amazon, you click on books, or you get these apps like Audible, and you click on books, they break it down into sections. Right? So they have, one of the most popular books right now is self-help books, right? Very popular. A lot of authors are writing books on self-help. Another one is business, the world of business, and you have the Christian, they call it spirituality, religious spirituality section. So if you go to the self-help book, you're probably not going to necessarily find a business book in that section because it's been broken down in that section. So as Christians tonight, don't miss this statement out, okay? We need to focus, again, remember statement number 2, see the similarities in all of our ups and downs. Number 3, see the differences in our ups and downs. Okay, here's the 2 statements I want you to get. Your book and my book are more similar than they're different. All right, now watch this. But your chapters and my chapters are more different than they're similar. Chew on that for a while. I'm going to say it again. Our books are more similar than different, but our chapters are more different than similar. Does that make sense? Digest that a little bit. I'll explain in just a second and I'll be done. In other words, as Christians then, we all have some similar ups and downs and struggles. Okay, let me ask you a question. How many struggle with flesh tonight? I do. Okay, we're similar. We relate there, okay? How many of us struggle with our prayer life? I do. Okay. how many of us struggle with just being faithful to serving God, right? So there's a lot of general things in the Christian walk that all of us can relate to. I mean, that's why I can go preach to a complete group of strangers in another country and begin to preach the Bible, and there's an immediate connection because there are a whole lot of similarities in our ups and downs. And that's what keeps us connected. You see, and God knows that. So Jesus feeds all of them at this particular time. Why? Because they were all hungry. They'd all been fishing all night. They all needed some food. So Jesus feeds all of them. They had a similar need at that moment. But he's about to talk to Peter as an individual because Peter, he had a different up and a particular down at this point than all the disciples. Why? Because he just got through denying Jesus Christ 3 times. And he knew it was what they call the elephant in the room. He knew it was the awkward subject that was going to come up. He was already embarrassed and ashamed. He had wept bitterly. Maybe he was even expecting a rebuke. I mean, one time Jesus called him Satan, get thee behind me. We know that's a whole other subject, and so on. But Peter's probably thinking, what's he going to say to me? How's he going to rebuke me? And instead, Peter gets exactly what he needs while Jesus is feeding the whole other group and taking care of them at the same time. And that goes back to the importance of your individual relationship with Jesus Christ. Because if you are secure in a relationship with him, you don't have a problem with somebody else's relationship with him. But if we only know him in the majority and the minority sense, then we'll get frustrated because we will assume they have an inner road to Jesus that we don't have. And the fact is, they don't. And none of the disciples in this passage were jealous of Peter this time. They knew Peter needed something different from Jesus at that time. Plus, they're all pretty happy because they were full Baptists at this time. Somebody say amen right there. Their bellies were full. They'd been working all night fishing. They were hungry. They were struggling with the whole picture thing. And Jesus shows up. And guess what's going to happen soon? These men are going to take the world and turn it upside down with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Jesus isn't even going to be there anymore. Why is it so important? Because they were learning the importance of that one-on-one relationship with Jesus Christ. And so that's what helps us with both questions raised tonight. What we want to do when our brothers and sisters struggle is this, is realize, in that case, that our ups and downs are similar. And that can help them. And then, we go to the second category, where you sometimes feel like we're jealous or maybe, man, God's blessing them more than us. Realize that our ups and downs are different, and it's okay. And that's the principle that Jesus is teaching us in this last chapter of the book of John. And that's why John makes this statement in the 9-3. Look at John chapter 21, and verse 24. This is the disciple which testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that this testimony is true. So John's saying this. I walked with him for 3.5 years. And I was there when he delivered the message to the masses. And I was there when he gave a message to just me, Peter, and my brother. And I was there to lay my head on his bosom. It was just me and him. And that's why John was the most secure disciple in his relationship with Jesus Christ. Even more so than Peter. And Peter was going to learn some Bible lessons even from John as time goes on. So number one, realize Jesus is able to communicate to the majority, the minority, and the individual. Number two, see that there's similarities in our ups and downs. Number three, see that there's differences in our ups and downs. Remember that our books are more similar than they are different. In other words, if you look at our books, they'll be in the same section of life. But our chapters, our books are more similar, but our chapters are more different than similar. Why is that? Well, some of these teenagers are only in chapter 3 of their life, while some of us are in chapter 19. In church, don't compare your chapter 4 to somebody else's chapter 20.
Good.
I'll never forget, many years ago, my brother and Pastor Jeff Harris, had read this book. It was based on a true story. It was a book about special ops mission that was run. It was written by a Christian man, and so it's a Christian perspective on military stuff. And the key character of the book, I mean, you saw from the book, it's just an incredible book. And they both called me and said, you got to read it, you got to read it. So I read the book after those two had already read the book. And so they were ahead of me in all those chapters, and I was reading it, and I finished the book, and after the book was all over, they both called me individually and said, how'd you like the book? I said, oh, it's amazing. Thanks for the recommendation. They said, what's your favorite part? I said, my favorite part is that the main character lived. He survived the book. Both of them were like, no, he died. No, he lived. No, he died. I said, no, he lived. I read the book. I just finished, he lived. Both of them went back and read the last chapter, and they totally missed a few sentences that gave you the clue that the main character lived. So my brother and Jeff Harris had been living for 6 months to a year, guessing that this character had died and he was alive the whole time. So I said, are you guys thankful that I read the book? And they said, shut up. All right, so. But the point I'm trying to make is this. Christian collaboration is important because watch this. We can learn from each other. Amen. Brother George's individual walk with God is going to be different than Brother Travis, going to be different than Brother Preston Davis's. My wife's walk with God is different than mine. But we can all come together and say, wow, this is what we need to hear. Wait a minute now. Sometimes he's on the up and I'm on the down, but it's okay because next time he might be on the down, I'll be on the up, and I'm okay with that because I'm here, sitting here with my head on his bosom.
Amen.
I'm okay. Our books are more similar than we think. It's just that our chapters are a little different. We'll find all of our books in the same section of life. And that's the life where we're pursuing a relationship with God. And that's how we help our brothers and sisters. Yeah. And that's how we deal with sometimes that devil's seed plant in our mind to get us thinking that God has cast us away and is shining grace favorably on somebody else. No. He's not doing that. He's right there for you too. And John chapter 21 does a great job of outlining how Jesus does that. Amen. Heads bowed, eyes closed, thanks for listening to us.
Hello, Pastor Randy Dignan here of Bible Baptist Church in Jefferson City, Missouri. I'm going to take a moment and express to you what our main vision and purpose is of this ministry. You see, much of this world today has a question. It's a question that was asked in John chapter 3 by one person. It's a question that is asked by the masses, but when you really think about it, it's really a question we all have to come to grips with, face to face with, one-on-one in our lives, sometime in our life. The question is this: where will I spend eternity? And that question was asked by a religious leader by the name of Nicodemus in John chapter 3. He approached Jesus Christ in the middle of the night and had a question about spiritual matters. Well, good thing for Nicodemus, he came to the right person at the right time because Jesus Christ is the answer in spiritual matters. You see, many of us have questions about that, and man has tried in many of its efforts to answer that question with their own ideas and philosophies. We've tried to come up with ideas on how to get us to heaven, how to confirm our way to heaven. But the fact is, we got to find out what God says about eternal things. And that's why asking Jesus Christ that question is so vital. Because when you ask Jesus a question, you get the answer. And as the question was asked, Jesus answered simply this: you must be born again. In John chapter 3, that's what he said to Nicodemus, and that's the same thing he says to you and to me, even today. You see, God is God of this universe, but he's not everybody's father. What does that have to do with John chapter 3? Well, think about this. We all have birthdays. We all are physically born onto this physical planet. Or else you wouldn't be able to watch me, or I'd be able to sign to you right now or talk to you at this time. But God, being a spiritual being, knew that though our bodies are temporal, our spiritual part of us, our spiritual anatomy of us, is an eternal thing. And so God says, I'm more concerned about the spiritual issues. So that's why he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for you and me 2,000 years ago and live again 3 days later so that you and I can have a spiritual birthday and know for sure that heaven is our home. Well, that leads to the next question. Why do we need a spiritual birthday? Well, it's simple. We're all sinners. We've all broken God's law and God's commands. But God loves us so much so that he let Jesus Christ become the substitute for your sin and my sin. So that if we recognize and admit that we are sinners, we can then trust in Jesus Christ as our substitute, and more so than that, our personal Savior, and know that on top of our physical birthdays, we have a spiritual birthday now, in that God becomes our Father, we become his sons, daughters, we become his children, and we know we're going to go to heaven someday. My friend, it's very simple. It's not about what the church says or what I have ideas about or what you have ideas about. It's finding out what God says directly to you and me. And he did it right there in the Bible, and in particular, John chapter 3, when Jesus says, you must be born again. If our church can help you with that question, if you have any questions about that, we can give you some answers. We'd be glad to help you in any way we can. Again, Pastor Randy, personally thanking you for watching the message. And again, if there's anything we can do for you, let us know. God bless and make it a great day.